Another of our webinars in our webinar series brought to you by the Marketing Institute of Ireland. My name is David Field and I'm the Chief Executive of the Marketing Institute and delighted to be here with you all this morning. And of course, for all of you who are members, all you do is log on to mii.ie and you can see the calendar of activity and events that we have coming up over the coming months. And also for all of those who aren't members who are listening in this morning, if you log on to mii.ie, it's very straightforward to become a member. And by becoming a member, you can have access to some great content that we've curated over the last number of months through our webinar series, as well as access to a number of training programs and education programs that we have in the Marketing Institute. So if you're not a member, please get in touch. We'd be delighted to have you join. So moving on to this morning, I am delighted to say we have an exclusive piece of research that's going to be shared with us this morning, and I think it's going to be really interesting and really thought-provoking. And to share this this new report with us is Gerard O'Neill, Chairman of Amoric Research, and Peter Smyth, CEO of IRS Plus. And for those of you who don't know Gerard trained as an economist and is a chairman of Amoric Research, where he also leads the firm's strategic consulting practice, working with senior management teams to create resilient strategies for the future. Gerard's a graduate of the London School of Economics, and in 2014 he was appointed a member of the National Statistics Board, the statutory body overseeing the development of official statistics in Ireland. Gerard is also a director of AMRO, was a co-founder of Ireland.ie, the jobs creation initiative, and writes for the popular blog Turbulence Ahead. And his book in 2016, A New Proclamation for a New Generation, is published by Mercier Press. Gerard is also the chairman of the Marketing Institute and a fellow of the Institute. And his colleague Peter Smyth today is the chief executive of IRS Plus. And Peter started his career in print as an account executive in the Irish Times and quickly climbed the management ranks within the Irish Times. He made the bold move into radio nearly 10 years ago as the sales director of News Talk. And with an unparalleled passion for local radio, Peter was appointed CEO of IRS Plus, a dynamic, centralised media sales house serving independent, local and national broadcast channels. Peter and his team are also the proud winner of an AIM Award for Marketing Innovation back in 2017, and we know how hard they are to win. So, to this morning, I'm delighted to say both Gerard and Peter are going to talk to us about the future is local, and that is a topic we're going to talk about. Everything we thought we knew about media, from patterns of consumer behaviour and buying policies, can largely be consigned to the past. And this is certainly a bold statement, but I think Gerard and Peter will tell us that the changing landscape for brands has shifted consideration towards new forms of media, which for some were largely untried. Local radio is one of these such examples, and now viewed as a highly trusted source of always-on information and a bridge to local communities. The second half of this year has seen a major shift in that perspective. But Gerard and Peter will bring us through this report, showing how to explore, and are going to explore some of the long-term consequences of changing consumer behaviour in their shift towards local, and why local radio is set to be able to play a bigger part in the landscape of the future. So before I hand over to both Gerard and Peter, as always, the content is recorded and will be sent out to our members. If you have any questions at all for both Gerard and Peter, please put them on the chat or the Q&A. And as always, I'll facilitate that Q&A at the end, around 15 minutes ago. And as always, we have our survey at the end. This is hugely important to us because it helps us shape our content for the future webinars. So please take the time to fill that out at the end. Without further ado, I will hand you over to, I think, Peter, who's going to say a few words, and then Gerard. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much for the introduction. As I said, my name is Peter Smyth. I'm the Chief Executive of IRS Plus. For those of you who don't know, we represent 15 local radio stations with 20% market share, which is roughly 1.2 million listeners. I'm going to keep it brief at the start and let Gerard do the presentation. I'd like to also thank Gerard for the report and the presentation today. Local radio has been a force in Irish media for a long time. The challenges brands are facing currently has seen broadcast media become a larger part of the marketing mix. As the brand representing local radio, there's been a shift this year with brand and category engagement. Local has become the new national narrative. This report proves why that engagement has increased as consumer spending and shopping behaviour is now driven by more local options. I'll hand you over to Gerard now. Thank you, Gerard.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to share my screen and you should hopefully be seeing my presentation of the research in front of you. So what I want to do is take you through some of the key findings from the study. Not all of them. There will be plenty more details in the report, which you'll receive later on or get the link later on. But I have to say, just at the beginning, this has been one of the most fascinating studies I've been involved in this year. It kind of was one of those studies that really got under the skin of people's changing psychology and behavior in the context of, obviously, the pandemic and the public health emergency, the lockdown and the consequences of that. And how it's beginning to affect so many other different aspects of our lives in terms of our media consumption, but also our spending behavior, working patterns, etc. And so therefore, as a study, it really gives us, I think, a really powerful set of insights into how brands and businesses can connect with the new realities that face all of us as citizens, but certainly all customers and consumers in Ireland, in terms of really how you can grow your business and how you can identify new ways of being relevant and connecting in the months and perhaps years ahead. The study itself, just to give you some more details on it, we did it at a time in July when we were coming out of the lockdown, we were coming out of the pandemic, but we'd been through and were in the midst still of a significant public health emergency that's affected everybody. But it has renewed and changed things in a significant way, our local communities and neighborhoods, how we live and work, obviously, but also how our own sense of identity and how that has changed as we find and spend more of our time living locally. So the report is really trying to tease out some of the longer term consequences of that. When we started out, we were, as I said, we did this in July, and we were thinking maybe by the time we're sharing the research with you in October, it might have changed significantly. But of course, now we find ourselves in a second lockdown, level 5, albeit with significant differences. So if anything, the habits that have been formed through 2020 are going to be with us for some significant time to come. And this research is really about trying to unpick some of those trends, some of those factors, and try and give you as agencies or as advertisers ideas and insights that will help guide you in your communications and planning activities in the months and indeed year ahead going into 2021. The study, the report, and the research is divided really into 3 parts. The first one is looking at the local media landscape. What media have an influence on the choices we face and the decisions that we make in our daily lives, from news to entertainment to shopping. The second part looks at kind of the business realities of all of that. We're all spending, many of us, more time locally, and therefore thinking and behaving differently, particularly influenced by local media, radio, of course, at the front of that. But thirdly, I think, and this is where we talk about some of the longer term consequences of this, I think the pattern of economic activity, the ways in which we spend our money, the channels we use, the priorities we adopt, all of that's changing fundamentally, has changed significantly. And beyond level 5 and whatever happens going into 2021, many of those changes will be permanent, and we need to be ahead of that in terms of trying to identify the product and service needs of customers and consumers going into 2021. So let's look at the first part of the study, the local media landscape. First of all, to put it in context, we love local radio in Ireland. 3 in 4 Irish adults listen to local radio. But the really interesting thing is that 6 out of 10 of those in our survey are listening to local radio more often since the start of the pandemic. So what we wanted to understand was, well, why is that? Why, given the already prevalent behavior around local radio listening and consumption, why are people actually doing more of that? Why would that become more significant for 6 in 10 of those listening to local radio? Well, the headline is, it's about these different factors. It's about relevance. It's about, for 60% of people listening more often, it's about the fact that they need to know what's going on. They're spending more of their time locally. They're not, maybe they're restricted in terms of distances you can travel, as we are currently at level 5, or they're working from home, so they're not commuting, they're not going to the office, they're not going into the city centres. So therefore, local radio just has a greater saliency, a greater relevance to them. But the other factor there is belonging. You know, we're in this together really does mean we together, we in our neighborhoods, in our communities, on our streets. People getting to know their neighbors better, spending more time talking, and therefore they want the media they consume to reflect that sense of belonging, that sense of community, that sense of togetherness. The other factor that some of them give is around familiarity. It's about the personality of the people they're listening to on the radio. It's about the voices. It's about that kind of reassurance, in a sense, that comes from the familiar, that comes from that sense of belonging, of course, but also that sense that these are people you know, but also know you, that somehow there's a connection or relevance again. The last one, by the way, not to mention, not to overlook it, is tone. And by that we mean the positivity. And this came through, and it's in various other measures in the report. I won't labor it, but a lot of people enjoy local radio at the moment because it's just more positive. They find a lot of the national media, they find other media sources just part of this doom and gloom loop that they want to get away from. And so that more positive, more upbeat tone that they get from local radio is something that they really welcome at the moment. I think it's also about that kind of classic sense of needing to have a feeling of control. And I think the things we have control over are what we do locally, and therefore local media, and particularly local radio, reinforces that sense of control, reinforces that sense of just knowing what you can do and what's within your grasp. And I think that psychologically, that's really, really important. And the positivity thing is reflected in that. It's about having that sense of connection, that sense of control that empowers you, and therefore means that you're not feeling the despair from gloomy headlines at a national or international level over which, frankly, you have no control. So I think that those factors are driving this significant shift in people's listening habits around local radio and their behavior in general. We see this then in terms of sources of local news. What are the best sources? We ask people to just pick from a long list. Now, obviously, all the relevant media are in the mix. Local radio stands out, of course, in this particular context as a best source of local news, but local news websites, including those that are associated with local radio and local newspapers, are also a major source. Paid for local newspapers, our local and radio newspapers are very prevalent and have been doing very well recently. Facebook, of course, social media, TV, local free sheets, the national media, of course, national newspapers, community websites, parish clubs, etc. WhatsApp, I'm on our local neighborhood WhatsApp, and it's very active at the moment, probably to do with Halloween and the arrangements around that, but I'm sure you've all experienced it, or many of you have experienced it, and of course others as well. But it shows you that people are hungry for local news content, and they will grab it from various sources. Local radio dominates, as you can see, but other sources of content are really important because, again, as I said, it reinforces the psychology of needing to feel connected, but also needing to feel some sense of control over the local world that you live in and operate in. It's not just about news, of course, it's also about local entertainment information. Where do you get the information about local entertainment? Radio is there again, of course. 59% say that's where their go-to source in terms of what's going on. But social media are in there, Facebook, that can be Facebook connected to your local clubs or societies, GAA, etc. And all the others are there as well. But even things like leaflets through the doors, posters, outdoor, all of those things are part and parcel of that landscape, that media consumption pattern. And I suppose one of the things that comes through very strongly in all the media research we've done over the years is the importance of trust in media. And we see that in our next slide, which is about when it comes to providing local news, which of the following do you trust the most? Local radio stands out, of course, for that. Local newspapers also very, very strong. And you can see it's that thing again about personality, about relevance, about just that sense of connection, intimacy, belonging, and so on. That identity that all of us have changed, our sense of identity, a sense of who we are, has probably been through a sea change because of what we've all experienced collectively since March this year. And therefore, that as our world has shrunk somewhat in terms of literally the boundaries around our travel, etc., then those local news sources stand out more, they're more salient in terms of trustworthiness. Now, that's not to say the national media are not trustworthy, they're in the mix, of course, as well, but the question here, remember, is about local news, the trusted sources of local news. And again, you can see that coming through very, very strongly here. So local radio stands out particularly in that. But I think one of the things that I think is very important in terms of the information that comes through here is that it's a two-way street. We see it here in terms of audience engagement. We see it here in terms of the things that people say that they've done with their local radio station. So taking part in a quiz or a survey, answering a question, being asked a question during the show, by answering a question by phone or text, information about events, contacting your radio station to give something a plug, for example, answering a call from your local radio station, other things. These are phenomenal levels of engagement, and that engagement, of course, reinforces trust, reinforces relevance, reinforces all of those things that we're talking about here in terms of the drivers of that new emotional connection, that new social contract between local radio and the audiences and communities that they serve, that has been driven, of course, by the public health emergency, but is now increasingly reflected in just our sense of identity and our sense of belonging and community, etc. So there's a level of engagement there, a level of interaction that I think, as I said, is a very powerful driver of those kind of changes that we're talking about. And I think, you know, the experience that we all have when we listen to local radio is very much driven by some of these factors. So, for example, when we ask people about the level of agreement with statements about whether they agree or disagree about things like, for example, the presenters on your local radio station are just as professional as the national radio presenters. 82% agree with that. 85% agree that they feel their local radio stations understand them better, understand the lives they are leading better. 57% say they're actually more open to persuasion from local radio, from obviously advertising, but the presenters themselves, because of that sense of the personal connection, that emotional connection that's there. Connection, of course, just feeling more connected is hugely important. And relationship, you know, one of the questions we asked was, well, would you miss your local radio presenter if they were no longer on the air? 69% said absolutely. That would be something that they feel that they have a relationship, driven, of course, by familiarity, by spending more time listening, perhaps, to local radio. But that sense of relationship is really important because it is all of our relationships, workplace, family, neighbors, community, local retail, etc. They've all changed, adjusted, shifted, and not surprisingly, our relationships with local media in general, local radio in particular, have also shifted. So I think, you know, this is just the first part of the study, but I think it's fair to say that what it's telling us is that the weeks and months that we've experienced in various levels of lockdown, level 5 constraints, restrictions, etc., has just driven significant changes to our behavior. They say it takes about 66 days or thereabouts on average for a habit to become deeply embedded, for it to become so embedded it's completely subconscious. You don't think about it anymore. 66 days, that's just over 2 months. Well, we've been through this for what, 8 months, heading into 9 months, longer even. And these changes, these habits that we've acquired are now deeply embedded. It's not a question of just lowering the levels and we'll all go back to the way things were way back in January or even February. They won't go back. These habits are profoundly significant in terms of our spending, in terms of how we identify ourselves, the relationships that we have with media, and therefore that embedded set of habits will continue really over the coming months and indeed possibly years as we adjust to the new normal and the new realities. All of this, of course, has massive implications for business. Big implications for local businesses, big implications for who we spend our money with, how we spend our money, massive implications for you in terms of persuading people to choose the brand or the product or the service that you offer through your advertising, through your communications. And we see again that when you ask people simple question, well, which of the following is the best source of information about sales and local sales and bargains? Well, again, local radio is a very significant source of that information, but local radio newspapers are there too. Social media, paid for newspapers, local websites, leaflets, door drops, let's not forget them. Community parish websites, GAA club, all of those are important, as of course our national media, as of course our Google, outdoor, all of that. But clearly people, as we spend more time literally walking, sometimes driving, certainly cycling in some cases, around our communities and our local areas, these are the things that frame our awareness of what's available in terms of advertising, products, services, and so on, and are driving the relationships that we have with brands, are driving the emotional connection that we have with brands, with products, and with the providers of products and services, with the businesses that provide them. And I think this has big importance in terms of how people are staying informed, staying in touch. We asked people, again, levels of agreement with different statements about local radio. So, for example, initiatives by their local radio to generate funding for local charities. They're much more likely to agree or support initiatives. 80% will support initiatives from the local radio around clubs, charities, local initiatives that, or indeed, of course, new openings, new stores, and so on. It's also about targeting. 79% of people in our survey agree that advertising on their local radio just feels more relevant. It feels more specific to them, more targeted. And 88% agree that they see local radio as a good way for businesses and brands to tell them about their products and services. There are fewer barriers there. They don't feel a disconnect. The barriers are down, you might say, in terms of their engagement with advertising and commercial messages through the local radio that they consume. And all of this, of course, has massive implications for shopping local. It's something we hear a lot of these days. We're seeing advertisements for it. I think it's fair to say many of us have consciously decided to really do our bit if we can in terms of the spending choices that we make. 86% of people in our survey say that they're happy to shop local, even if they had a choice to shop somewhere else, even if it wasn't level 5 and you couldn't go beyond the limits. 86% are actually consciously looking to shop local, prefer local stores, local service providers, their local cafe, their local restaurant, etc. 87% are deliberately trying to support local retailers. So it's just a conscious decision that they're making, whether it's decisions about online with large multinational providers, or maybe shop even on the website if you're a local retailer. And I think it's really interesting that 89%, 9 in 10 adults in our survey say that they will in fact continue to shop local to the extent that they can after the lockdown is over. Back to habits again. Months after this has all started, it's become more normal for us to consciously think about, could we spend our money locally? Could we choose a local retailer, a local service provider, cafe, restaurant, takeaway, rather than go somewhere else? And I think that embedding that kind of local consciousness is something that is reflected in much of what we're seeing in the research. And I think this also impacts on advertising priorities. We asked people in our research about the things they actually would like to hear advertised more. What are the things that they want to hear more of from local radio? Here's a selection of them. 74% want to hear about money-saving offers, deals, special offers in their local shops through their local radio. 61% want to hear about new stores or cafes opening in their area, or new leisure entertainment outlets. Those are the things that, again, are connecting with them in terms of the local lives that all of us are leading at the moment. Of course, over half also want to hear about jobs and openings and new recruitment opportunities as well. 46% want to hear about websites, apps that will help them save money, will help them maybe manage their money more effectively, manage their demand for financial services more effectively through local radio. So they are saying, look, they're giving permission to local radio to be the source of the channel to connect them with the businesses and the brands that are providing these kind of services. And of course, nearly 3 in 10 are saying they also want to hear about houses for rent, to buy, apartments, all of that as well through local radio. So I think it's telling us something very significant here about how right now, certainly going into November 2020, local radio is a very significant channel in terms of people's priorities for how they want to spend and save money. They're open to other ways of engaging, perhaps with brands and products through local radio, reflected in this research. And I think it's telling us that there's a new kind of emotional relationship there with local radio that, and maybe, you know, there's a challenge here, particularly for brands, around asking yourselves if the brand values, the brand emotions that are part of your positioning are resonating with this new local reality, this new local mindset, these new local realities that will be with us for some time to come. I think it's also worth adding, by the way, that whilst these are all nice things to know, the size of the prize is quite significant. You know, about 60% of all spending on groceries, 60% of all spending on mobile, on broadband, 60% of all expenditure even on energy in the home is accounted for by local radio listeners. That's their share of voice, their share of wallet of local radio audiences is, you know, at least €6 on every 10 for all of those spending categories, and many, many more, according to our research. So the size of the prize in terms of that local economy, that local consumer landscape, is enormous. We're talking, you know, 60 billion plus in spending this year, next year, framed by that channel, local radio, but framed by that new world that we're all living in, which is much more localized, much more about community, neighborhood, local outlets, supporting local, and all of that. So I guess maybe to sum up or to finally talk about the other element of our study, the last element, which is about local community. So we've seen that local radio has enormous salience in terms of news, of course, information, shopping. We've seen that people's framework around their spending patterns and priorities is very localized and much more positive and much more deliberately focused on local, despite the lockdown and even beyond the lockdown. But what does that, I think the last thing is to talk about local community in all of this. And some of the things that people are telling us about life after the lockdown. 77% of adults, over 3 in 4, agree that there's a stronger sense of community where they live since the lockdown. 6 in 10 adults agree that they've gotten to know their neighbours better since the lockdown. 61% in Dublin, funnily enough. It's not just a rural or outside of Dublin phenomenon. A similar proportion feel they know more about their local area and community since the lockdown. 63% of 25 to 34-year-olds, by the way, agree with that statement. So that sense of identity that's so important to all of us in terms of shaping our behavior, but also our priorities in our lives, that's got richer, it's got stronger. And 3/4 feel that people in their area should be proud of how they've helped each other during the lockdown, 79% of women in our survey. So those are the kind of really deep cultural changes that are taking place throughout Ireland, not rural Ireland, not suburban Ireland, urban Ireland as well. These are the changes that are really shaping the kind of country we're becoming, the kind of priorities that we have. And, it's reinforced in some of the other statements in our study. 3/4 of adults wouldn't want to lose the sense of community that has developed during the lockdown after it's all over. 81% of IRS plus listeners. 9 in 10 agree they will continue to stay in touch and help out with neighbours and their local community after lockdown. 93% agree we'll all need to work together in our community to help with the recovery in the local economy. Actually, one of the study's findings was that 80% agree that local radio will play a key part in helping their community recover. So people are really beginning to look ahead, to anticipate how we're all going to respond to the experiences we've been through and the challenges that it has left us with. 94% agree people will need to do more to support local businesses and employers when the lockdown is finally over. And finally, 64% of adults will pay more attention to local radio after the lockdown, so they know what's going on in the area, higher among women in our survey. So you can see, again, the significant changes that have taken place in the mindset of people throughout Ireland as a result of the lockdown, that our worldview has shifted. It's become certainly more local, it's become more community-driven, more neighbourly. We're adopting patterns of behaviour, some of them compelled, of course, but I think increasingly we've adopted them voluntarily. We want so many of these things to continue. And so I think it's telling us that we're not only in this together, but we want to remain together when this is all over. So finally, I think what our research is capturing is a critical shift, a transition to a post-pandemic world, and we should dare think about that even after level 5. And that local radio has not only just supported people through this, but will continue to play an important part afterwards. And I think it also shows the power of local radio at a time when a growing share of consumer spending, that economic footprint I talked about, and shopping behaviours are now driven by a very deliberate, chosen focus on local options. And I think as long as this continues, and these habits have now become deeply embedded, I think we can confidently predict that the future is indeed local. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you, Gerard. My God, fascinating. I was scribbling down stats to beat the band as you were going through them there. But geez, incredible piece of insight. I'm sure people listening might have a question or two for both Peter and Gerard. So please post them on the chat or in the questions and answers. But Gerard, just to kick off, Gerard. We talked about 6 out of 10, 60% of listeners are listening more to local radio. And I think you call that 60% because of relevance, 37% because of belonging, 30% familiarity, and 10% tone. Just pick up on that piece on tone, because that seemed to be more of a, I get the relevancy piece and obviously that sense of community, and that's really shining through in the thing. But just talk to me a little bit about the tone that you referred to there.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, David. I didn't want to belabor it, but there are other data points in the report that talk to it, which is about, again, I think people, whilst they accept and recognize, of course, the seriousness of the public health emergency that we're still living through, they have found an excessive focus on negativity to be a real turn-off for some media in terms of their consumption. And what they particularly were telling us in the research was that they found the more positive tone, the more upbeat tone, the more you can do something tone of local radio, something that they really engage with. It's positive, it's encouraging, it's empathic, but it also, as I said, it gives them that sense of control. They don't get that from some of the coverage at a national level, because they don't. None of us have real control over that. But in your local community, in your neighborhood, with your neighbors, you have some control, and you can get that feeling from what you're hearing day in, day out, particularly on local radio.
Okay, great. Thanks, Gerard. Peter, just in relation to the challenges that brands are facing, I think Gerard alluded to there, there's been a broadcast media is becoming a bigger part of the marketing mix, and local is the new traditional narrative. What does this mean for brands and media planners, say, for argument's sake, across the industry at the moment?
That's an interesting question. I suppose if you look at the way traditionally that broadcast, or in particular radio, has been planned over the years, but obviously there is a little bit of a shift this year. If you relate it to TV is based on share. Radio is quite different. And the process for planning has always been traditionally possibly national first, urban second, and then local. And that's the way the plan has been divvied out. But with this engagement, with the research that's being presented here today, there is perhaps, or should be, a consideration. Should it be local first? Is that the focus, that you build your local audience first and then fill in after that? Because it does. We're so engaged locally now, and as we mentioned, that local is the new national narrative.
Interesting. Even alluding to some of those advertising cards. I was in the financial space, Gerard. I think some of those figures you quoted, 74% are looking for money-saving offers. 46% are looking for money management apps, that type of thing. So it's the research very clearly calls out what certain areas you should be really doubling down on local radio, I take it.
Yeah, I think also to add to that, I think. Look, a lot of people are sitting on a lot of money they haven't spent. They haven't spent it on holidays, or they haven't spent it on travel, or they haven't spent it on, driving their car to work and back. And we see that in the central bank data. And I think really what I would be saying is that there's a pot of money there that consumers will be spending, but I think framed by not only the obvious constraints in terms of whatever level we're on by Christmas, or indeed Q1, Q2 next year, but also by that real commitment, that genuine commitment and passion to do more locally. Because I think, there's an old saying that, who was it, Tip O'Neill, that all politics is local. Well, I think all consumption is local. I think we need to be thinking that way. And I think, to Peter's point, that if you start with that reality, that perspective, that it's where we start from in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our local areas, then you'll get a sense of where to connect with people and what are their priorities going to be for spending that pot of money and their other incomes in the future.
Very good. Built from the bottom up. A few questions are coming through here. Kira Holmes here, a question. Is there a rural v urban bias in terms of the share of listenership around local radio, particularly around news and current affair programs, interested from a PR earned media perspective?
Well, if I can comment on that, I'm sure Peter can comment too. But in our research, there wasn't actually that kind of bias. So to be honest, I'll be perfectly honest. I had my biased expectation there might be an urban-rural difference. Talking as I am from the darkest black rock at the moment, but actually no, we didn't see that coming through at all. Local radio is just so pervasive. It's suburban. It's not just rural. It's urban as well, of course, and so here in the Greater Dublin area as well. So it's not there. And I would have to I'd be honest, a slightly bigger comment, philosophical comment here. The urban-rural thing doesn't really exist, I think, anymore from a marketing and business and consumer perspective, and certainly not in a media perspective.
Okay, interesting. The question, Jason's kind of building on that. Was there significant differences geographically on the results, which I take it there wasn't of any major significance?
No, we would have called them out, and there are a few called out in the report where we thought there might be a difference, but actually there's very little.
Okay, is there a shift in the devices they are listening to? Clodagh Crow, I think, that's asking that question. Is there a shift in the devices they are listening to local radio on?
We captured a little bit on that. It's still obviously radio, but of course, a lot of the time it was also car. So it's shifted away from the car to the house. But of course, apps as well are very important. And so smartphones are still coming through, and of course, laptops and so on. Peter, I don't know if you've any other information on that.
Yeah, I'd echo that as well, but I suppose part of the journey that we went on here, sorry, there's a bit of noise outside the office. I hope that's not disturbing anybody there. But part of the journey we went on was a discovery that obviously habits had changed and the commute had significantly changed for people in the car. So a lot of the urban areas, a lot of the local areas, people not traveling back and forth. So that's a big part of why we want to discover where the habits have gone and where they changed to. So we think that we've had consistent listenership from morning to evening. In particular, we always do in the mid-morning, and perhaps some competitors of ours would have better drive times, but I think that has shifted. I think that has changed where people are switching on earlier and switching on later. So
yeah, I thought we spoke about this yesterday, Peter. Certainly, I think people's radio listening patterns have changed considerably. A couple of questions here. What are we anticipating from the upcoming JNLR? Peter, maybe one for you.
Oh, that's a tricky one. Look, I would always say, particularly for ourselves, we are always consistent. I can't think of in the 7 years that I've been with IRS and local radio, we've always had pretty much the same market share. So it doesn't really change that much. That's where the consistency comes from. You would I suppose hazard a guess that with the habits change, perhaps there is a little bit of an upturn for local radio, or probably more talk radio as well, because how engaged people are. But I don't know if you would agree with that, Gerard. But again, we won't know till we know.
Yeah, I suppose I should caveat our own study. It's not the JNLR for local radio, so obviously we'll wait and see what the JNLR has to say. But I think, one of the things that we have found, and I see one of the questions coming up there about age groups, is that in a way people's behaviours have changed quite significantly in the past 8-9 months, obviously, and even young people we're finding now coming through in terms of listening to the radio. They may be listening to it because they've no choice, they've nowhere to go, but they are listening to it maybe more than they would have in the past. And I think there's been a kind of almost a leveling of radio consumption to a certain extent. I need to go back and check all the trend data, but I think that at the moment, in terms of radio listening, it's funny, we're spending more time watching TV. We see this, we track media consumption for the Department of Health in their weekly tracking study around the pandemic, and we look at media consumption, and it's the old media, TV, press, radio, that are dominating people's consumption patterns at the moment. You could throw in outdoor into that mix as well. It's not Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram. They're there, of course, but they're not for they're not in media. They're obviously more for just one-to-one communications and so on.
Yeah, well, isn't that interesting, huh? I'm not surprised at all by that, Gerard, I have to say. Another question here from Eamon Clark. What national brands do the best jobs connecting locally? I don't know if you've any view on that, Peter.
Well, I could give. Yeah, obviously I'm post. But what we have seen again, and I briefly touched on it in the opening, is that certain categories are engaging with local audiences more, and what they're tending to do is try to deliver a local tone of voice. It's what local radio is really good at. Although radio is a companion media, local radio just you have that friend during the day, and we have that consistency during the day. And when they build their creative or they deliver a local tone of voice, it tends to be more effective. And we've seen that in banking and finance this year. We've seen it in telcos. We've seen it particularly in retail. Retail has really engaged with that as well. So all of those categories, I think, I don't know, Gerard, from your point of view.
Yeah, I think I mean, we did another report last week on customer experience in Ireland, and the top 10 winners were all of those who are essentially serving local communities, credit unions, the supermarkets and pharmacies. And I think it's that what's happened is that those brands that are very much people-based, whether it's frontline staff or just general one-to-one interactions, they're the ones that are really standing out for consumers at the moment. The banks, to their credit as well, those that have in their local communities had a local face to represent the brand, have really done extremely well in terms of people's respect for what they've done, their positivity, their engagement, and so on. So those brands that have kind of brought their communications local and personal, I think, are the ones that have thrived.
Yeah, I think SuperValu have done a good job at that as well. If I'm honest with you, back to your point about the retail side of things. Yeah, well, I'm interested on the audience engagement side of things. Gerard, you alluded to some stats there. 42% participated in a quiz, 27% participated in question, 18% answered a call. Does that over-index versus, I suppose, what you'd call the national broadcasters or the national radio stations? So is there a little bit more, back to the points we talked about relevance, belonging and familiarity, is there more engagement at that level? In other words, then, from a marketeer's perspective, is it more than just buying spots, and actually it's about creating kind of engagement, you know what I mean, those sponsorship opportunities, etc., etc. Is that really where it comes to the fore, I suppose?
Yeah, that's a great point. The sponsorship point's a very good point. That whilst we don't have other comparison points within this study, I have looked at the same sort of issue in terms of engagement with media in other studies in the past. And the numbers in our study for IRS Plus are huge. And I think it's something about that. There's a kind of a tangibility, I'd say a lot of people drive past their local radio station from time to time, depending on which part of the country they live in. So it's real for them, it's tangible. And I think that tangibility, that accessibility is the reason that we're seeing such huge levels of engagement. And, I think that was almost, you might call that the benchmark level of engagement. I think, to your point, David, I think, sponsors, other retailers, other brands, to the earlier question, could actually start to leverage that interactivity, that level of engagement, that kind of two-way channel that has been created by local radio in a much more positive way, particularly in terms of sales campaigns and new openings and other things that they might want to do.
Yeah, and when you think to those numbers that you spoke about, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you were saying 6 out of every 10 euro in those what you would call traditional spending categories. But you're talking about, did you say 60 billion?
That's right. Yeah, but it's about 100 billion this year, so that's about 60 billion. So that's the kind of the size of wallet, if you like, in terms of that local radio listeners and their spending power. And the fact that so much spending is now local is constrained spending, but still it's a huge prize for businesses that are looking to recover coming out of what we're in, and looking to grow going into 2021.
Yeah, but when you read through that now, I'm just thinking it with your, if you were the brand custodian and you were thinking to yourself, my God, I need to drive a business. This piece of research is giving huge insight into planning, I think, for the future. So, Peter, I'm sure you're absolutely delighted with this report, and I've no doubt it's going to get some great traction. And we're certainly delighted to be the exclusive to launch it with you exclusively. It's a fascinating piece of fascinating report.
Yeah, there's some parts actually surprised us because over a period of time, we anecdotally or worked with stations in terms of their own surveys that they would do, and they would talk about local creative or the local ads that people listen to versus the national ads as they discussed them. And we talked about a percentage difference that there was relatively a 70-30, that majority of the local ads felt like, well, they're from my community, they're messages that I should hear. And there was a little more of a 30% focus of national ads, but this is actually trumped that and coming in at the 79% and 88% in terms of selling. Yeah. So the brands that get that creative correct and really get the local tone of voice and deliver the cut through will get greater engagement. So that's what this really tells us,
Yeah, brilliant. Listen, guys, absolutely fascinating. Just coming up to 5 to 12, so we're bang on time. But listen, I think I've covered all the questions, unless anybody has any last-minute questions. But look, a fascinating piece of research, I have to say, and I'm really interested, Gerard, I have to say, in relation to that habit-breaking thing. You hear the ads on radio actually or on TV about the 28 days or something to do with smoking and things like that, and what you're saying that ultimately 66 days will properly embed a new habit, and it'll be really interesting to see post-pandemic, whatever that looks like, how quickly new habits will be formed or not. And to your point, will we just all have this new way of living, and it's going to be so fascinating to see that unfold. But when you call out some of those figures out, about 64% will pay more attention to local radio, 93% work together and want to work together to drive the local economy. 89% want to stay in contact, or 75% stay in contact. It just demonstrates that if nothing else, this pandemic will ultimately benefit rural Ireland and maybe outside city centres as much as anything else. Is that a fair point?
Yeah, I agree, and I think look, in a way, it kind of talks to our psyche and our culture as a people. We're very much a people that is kind of clannish. We very much identify with our community, our local area, our parish or club, whatever it is. And I think that's just been reinforced mightily by what we've all lived through. And I think that kind of, it's part of our cultural DNA. And I think it's really just coming through, manifesting itself very, very strongly, and will continue to do so.
Great. Okay, guys, listen, we'll leave it at that. Peter and Gerard, thank you so much for sharing this report with us this morning. We're absolutely delighted, and I've got lots of people here. I didn't go through them all, but saying excellent research, excellent presentation. When can we get it? So we'll obviously be sending it out, and I've no doubt, Peter, there'll be people listening, getting plenty of airtime, pardon the pun, this afternoon and over the next couple of days.
Yeah, and we'll be obviously releasing to the national newspapers. It'll be on our website, and anybody that wants any details at all, just get in touch. So
brilliant.
Appreciate that.
Brilliant. Okay, well, gents, we'll say our goodbyes. Gerard, thank you as always, and Peter, really appreciate it, and thanks a million, and good luck with the report.